Before we move on with coding the roll the dice button, let's talk about another important topic that is closely related with the DOM and DOM manipulation, and that's events. Events are like notifications that are sent to notify our code that something happened on the web page. And events are triggered by things like clicking a button, resizing a window, scrolling down, or even pressing a key. We can use event listeners to code responses to all these events, like opening a pop-up window, showing animations, and so on and so forth. So an event listener is just a function that basically sits there and waits for a specific event to happen. And how is that event then processed? Well, first we need to remember about the execution stack. And that's because the rule is that an event can only be processed or handled as soon as the execution stack is empty, which means that all the functions have returned. So in here, we currently have two execution contexts on the stack, so these have to return first. Just like this. Okay, so besides the execution stack, we also have something called the message queue in the JavaScript engine. This is where all the events that happen in the browser are put, and they sit there waiting to be processed, which, as I said, only happens once the execution stack is empty. And that is the case now here in our example. So the next event in the line will now get processed. Remember from the last slide that we can have something called an event listener, which is a function that reacts to an event. So that event listener is now called. And since it's a function, it gets its own execution context, which is then put on top of the stack and becomes the active execution context. So this is how events are processed and how event listeners work. So let's now use what we just learned in practice in the rest of the lecture. In this lecture, you will learn how to set up an event handler, what a callback function is, and also what an anonymous function is. You will also learn another way to select elements by IDs and how to change the image in the HTML image element. Alright, so let's now set up our event handler. And the first step is to select the element in which the event will happen. So in this case, it will be the button where we will roll the dice. So this button here, right? So let's go into our HTML file and find out how this one is called. And it's this one here, so roll dice, and the class for this one is the button roll button, right? So btn roll. Okay. Once again, we need to select this element. So by now you've seen that it always works like this. So we first select something using query selector, so like this, and then after that we do something with that selection that the query selector method returns. So once again, we use the document.query selector, and now we use the button roll. Alright, so we have our selection, and now we can add the event listener, which is as simple as this, add, and here we already have it, so add event listener. And here we have two arguments. The first one is the event type, which in our case is simply click. So there are a lot of events, as I told you, and this one is the click event, but there are a lot of them. And so we have a nice handy reference, which I already have here. So once again, this is on the MDN webpage, where I also showed you the operator precedence table. So let's search for the one that we use. So click. So this is the click event. And it's one of the mouse events, but there are lots of them. So mouse enter, mouse move, mouse over, mouse down, mouse up, and all of these events. Then we have drag and drop events. We have these media events. And we also have keyword events up here, clipboard events, so when we copy or cut something. And as you see, lots of events are possible. For example, when the page unloads or when our page loads, and all these kinds of events. So when you need something else, beside click or beside anything that we will learn in this course, you can just come to this reference here and use it from there. Okay, so the first argument to the addEventListener is the type of event. Now the second part is the function that will be called as soon as the event happens. So for now I will leave this empty. So imagine that we would have a function that we want to call when we click on the button. So I'm just going to call it function button with no parameters and just like this. Do something here. Okay. So remember, if we wanted to call this function, we would do it like this, button and then the call function operator, which is this one, right? So in order to call a function, we always use these parentheses. Now, if we want to use this function as our function that is called here, as soon as we click on the button, then we would simply do it like this, just the name of the function without the parenthesis operator, because we don't want to call it right here. We want the event listener to call the function for us. And this button function is then called the callback function. And that's because it's a function that is not called by us, but by another function. So this is what a callback function is, a function that we pass into another function as an argument, and this function, in this case the event listener method, will then call that function for us. Alright, but what if we didn't want to have an external function that gets called by the event listener? We could simply add a function right here. So instead of having this function name here, we could write our function right here. And that would be an anonymous function. So another concept here. So an anonymous function is simply a function that doesn't have a name, so it cannot be reused. We can just write function here, like this, then the usual way with our curly brackets, open it, and then write our function code right here, such as we did before. So once again, we can do something here. Again, if we don't want this function here on the outside, we can very simple write our function right here into this event listener method. And we do that by writing an anonymous function, which is a function that doesn't have a name and that we therefore cannot use outside of this context here. So we cannot call this function button to use it then later in another place. So this function can then only be used here. But in this case, that's what we want, because we don't want to use the button function anywhere else. All we need this to happen is when someone clicks on the button. So an anonymous function is the perfect solution here in this case. And this is usually the way that we handle this. Now, what happens as soon as someone clicks the button? So let's use comments here to define our next steps that we have to take here. So first, we need a random number. Right, and we already did that. So let's already copy this here into our function. So we only need this number as soon as someone hits the button, right? We don't need this right after our application loads. We only need this as soon as someone clicks. Okay, and after that, what we need then is to display the result, right? And after that, what we want to do then is to update the round score, but only if the rolled number was not a 1. Because remember, if we roll a 1, then we lose our current score and it's the next player's turn. Alright, so here our dice variable, I will actually only declare the variable here in this function because I don't need it from the outside. So remember, due to the scoping chain, here in the outside scope, we will only have access to the variables that are in the scope and not access to the variables that are in the scope of another function. So I will remove it from here. And now this function is the only one that has access to the dice variable. But the other way around, from this function here, we have access to the outer scope, right? So in this function, we will have access to the scores, the round score, and active player variables. And this is very important. So once again, the scoping chain is something very important and really important also to understand. Okay, so we have our random number. Now we also need to display the correct dice number, right? So we first have to make it visible again because we hid it up here. So we set the display style to none. So the first thing is to bring the style back to block. So in CSS, when we want to display something as a block, we simply use the display property and set it to block. So document.query selector, and we see from up there that it's just the class dice. And then .style and .display and set it to block. Alright, but we also need to set the correct number, right? And this is why these images, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, have the number here in their name. So this is a trick that I used so that now it's very simple for us to display the correct name. All we need is to write this name and then add the number of the dice value that was rolled, right? So if we roll 1, then we need the dice 1 image. And the same thing for the other numbers. So how do we do that? Once again, we will select our dice, but instead of always doing the same selection over and over again, which is a process that takes up some time, so it's not perfect if we do all the same operation all the time. So what I can do instead is to create a variable where I store the selection and then use this variable whenever I need it. So I will create a new variable, and once again, we only need it in this scope and not in the outside. So I only declare it here in this function. And I will call it dice DOM, simply because it's the DOM object for this dice. And so now I'm going to copy this part because this is effectively our selection, right? So query selector of the dice is what we select. And now all we have to do is to use the variable that we just created. So we can make it like this. And now down here, we can use it again. And we don't have to make the selection over and over again. Now, how do we change the image of an image element? So we see here that the image is an IMG element and the source is what defines which image is displayed. So it's very simple to change this source attribute because in JavaScript all we have to do is exactly that, source, src. And so now we use this trick that I told you about. We just write this part of the name, so dice and then the number that was rolled. So dice plus, so actually dice, right? Because this variable here, which has the number from 1 to 6, which the dice rolls. And now we just need to add the final .png plus .png. And that's it. So it's now time to test this again. So let's reload this and then roll the dice. And now this is not really working. So let's check out the console. And the error that we get is that the dice is not defined in line 20. So let's check that one out. And yes, indeed. So here we use the dice, but it's not defined because it's only defined down here. But it's not a problem because these lines here in the beginning, they were only to show you some things which I don't want anymore here anyway, because we are just going to use these inside of a function or even of another function. So these one were just to test some things. So I will just cut them here and put them down here in case I need them later. And I will need them, of course. So the only thing that matters for our application here really is these variables, then hide the dice, and then our event listener function here. So let me close this, reload, and now it's going to work. Alright, so 5, 6, 6, 3, and so on. So now this works. Really cool, right? So our game is starting to look nice, right? What I want to do now is to actually set these values here to 0. And I'm not going to do that in the HTML code, but right in the JavaScript. So let's do that. So we come here to our HTML to see how these are called. And these are the score 0, current 0, and score 1 and current 1 IDs. So these are IDs. Now we could of course use the document.querySelector just fine, such as we did before, but I want to show you another method now, which is the document.getElementById instead of querySelector. So this only works for IDs, but is faster than querySelector. So sometimes when we have IDs, instead of just using querySelector all the time, we use getElementById for IDs. So let's do that. So document.getElementById. And now we don't use the CSS style, so we don't use the hash symbol such as we did if we would use the query selector, but all we do is to put the name in here. So it's score 0 and then text content, as you already know, right? And set it to the string of 0. And I will now duplicate this line and we'll do the same for the score 1. And I will actually duplicate it 2 more times. So we do it for the current 0, and then current 1. Okay, and with this we set all the 4 values to 0. So again, we could have used query selector here, but we used the getElementById method, which is a bit faster. And also because I want to show you that query selector is not the only way that we have to select elements. So let's now check this out. And indeed, everything is now set to 0. Alright, are you excited to continue with this? Then come with me right to the next lecture.